Around the world, populations are aging rapidly. There is currently more than 1 billion people over the age of 60, representing 14% of the global population. By 2050, this population will have more than doubled to 2.1 million. Amidst the backdrop of the United Nations Decade of Healthy Aging, continued rise of non-communicable diseases, and in the context of vaccine hesitancy among the Canadian population, now is the opportune moment to discover and explore health promotion campaigns to increase awareness about vaccine-preventable diseases and inform the public about the benefits of a life course approach to immunization. My name is Anna Sangster, Director of Policy and Innovation at the International Federation on Aging. Join me for an exciting two-part podcast series celebrating and recognizing the immense importance of Shingles Awareness Week in Canada, which is from February 27th to March 5th. This series aims to increase our collective understanding and awareness of the knowledge gaps that exist among Canadians regarding shingles and shingles vaccination, tapping into clinical expertise and incorporating the invaluable patient perspective. Shingles, also known as herpes zoster, is a debilitating vaccine-preventable disease, which significantly impacts functional ability and quality of life. Older adults are at greatest risk of shingles, with the highest burden in those aged 50 years and older. Despite the benefits of shingles vaccination, awareness, access, and uptake remain startlingly low.
Welcome to the second podcast in celebrating Shingles Awareness Week. My name is Katrina Buzanis, and I'm a program manager at the International Federation on Aging. This podcast will be focusing on the patient perspective of shingles and how it affects daily living. So with that being said, it is my pleasure to welcome Miss Jenna Greenspoon. Miss Greenspoon is a 38-year-old mom of 2 children and 2 bonus children. She lives in Toronto with her family, and she has a background in education and currently works for a tech company. She leads a busy life, always running from one place to the next with her children. So thank you so much, Ms. Greenspoon, for joining us today and also for sharing your experiences with us.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to start off with just asking you a little bit about your experience with shingles. So can you share a little bit about that? And when did you first start noticing symptoms and what was going through your mind at the time?
Yeah, so I think that it wasn't like an easy sort of, I have the flu, I know what's wrong with me kind of situation. I was actually walking through the mall and I was just doing regular everyday activities. And I felt like it was almost painful to have my shirt touching my body. And it was a really strange feeling. It wasn't anything I'd sort of ever had before. The way I could sort of describe it is as if I had like a horrible scrape that was on the torso of my body, and anything that rubbed against it was hurting. And I remember I kept checking, there was nothing there. And I remember I had to literally walk holding the shirt like away from my body so that it wasn't rubbing on my skin. It's one of those situations where you don't want to sound, like you're crazy and you think, okay, well, maybe, I'm just feeling a little bit off today, or, something's wrong. It's also one of those situations where you're like, well, is this something I tell my doctor? What exactly am I going to say? Oh, I feel like, I have a scrape, but I don't. It's kind of a difficult thing to explain. And so you're not exactly sure who to tell or when to tell, whoever that may be. And so, yeah, that was really my experience. And then, I would continuously check in the mirror, like, is there anything there? Is there anything I'm missing? The pain had continued to my back. And so obviously that's a part that's a little bit more difficult to see. But again, it was like under my bra strap, and it felt like it was, very uncomfortable, like there was something there, and I kept checking it and didn't see anything. And then later on, I developed something visible, a visible rash. And then at that point, it felt like, oh, okay, well, now there's clearly something there. So now there's something to talk about.
And did you know what shingles was at the time? Did you know that those might be the symptoms?
No, I didn't know at all. So I think about different types of viruses or diseases or things that you should be aware of that are very common. Certainly no one that I, spent time with or involved in my life had really ever talked about or complained about having shingles. So it wasn't really something that was on my radar. And so it wasn't something that I initially suspected.
Yeah. So then did you kind of immediately go see a doctor and then you were diagnosed? Is that how it happened?
Yes, exactly. So then at that point I said, okay, there's something worth talking about here. It's really uncomfortable. I made an appointment with my doctor, and it was a very quick diagnosis. Just as I was lifting up my shirt, being able to see what was there was, yes, this is absolutely shingles, and let's get you on medication right away.
And so you've mentioned some of the early symptoms, but I wonder if you could just describe a little bit more kind of how the symptoms felt and also how they changed over time, because I think maybe that's something that people are a little bit less aware of as well, is how the symptoms can evolve over time.
Yeah, absolutely. So at least in my case, initially, as I mentioned, there wasn't anything there. It was just this burning sensation, this discomfort when my clothes touched my body. And that did last for quite some time. It wasn't like one day, I had the sensation and then the next day I had a rash. But instead it did last a little bit longer. So again, it was like a burning sensation. It felt like chafing, rubbing, a lot of discomfort. And so I would kind of just, try and get myself in a comfortable position or wear looser clothing when I was working, so that it wasn't, constantly sort of bothering me. But then it became harder to ignore or harder to sort of make do with, especially when it then appeared on my back again, right under my bra strap. There was constant touch in that position. And so, then it became much worse. And then that's when, I started to see, the actual rash on my body that I was then able to, it's almost a little bit of a relief when you're able to identify, okay, there is something there. And so there is something that's not 100% right.
Yeah, I can imagine. I'm sure it's such a relief to know that now at least you're taking steps to deal with it.
Yes, exactly.
So I wonder what was the recovery process like, and are you fully recovered now, or do you still experience any lingering symptoms?
Yeah. So, I mean, my understanding is that I've been quite lucky with my experience with shingles, as I know that you can have, long lasting pain, that doesn't go away for quite some time, and that there are long-term effects. And I was very lucky that once the medication kicked in, the rash didn't necessarily go away very quickly. And so, in my personal life, even having my kids, hug me or touch me in a place where, that was prevalent, I was concerned, I didn't want anybody to, come in contact with that area whatsoever, despite the fact that I was starting to feel better. And so, there was like a little bit of, even though I was starting to feel better, there was still sort of, like mentally, it was something that I was constantly aware of. And then I think it also, is one of those situations where, what it felt like in the beginning, when there wasn't anything to necessarily identify, that you're almost a little bit more on edge every time you start to feel something, because you want to be able to identify it so much earlier, or right away, to avoid it from getting any worse. But I do, like I said, I know that it can be quite awful and quite long lasting. And in my case, thankfully, I didn't have any long lasting conditions.
Yeah, thankfully. So we're here speaking today kind of in celebration and recognition of Shingles Awareness Week. And so the theme for this year's Shingles Awareness Week is missed moments. So shingles isn't just a rash, that's part of the theme that we're talking about, and it can affect people's lives, and it can cause people to miss out on some important life moments. So I'm curious if that resonates at all with your experience.
Yeah, it absolutely does. So I actually was, planning to go on a trip with my family, and I had started to feel this, a few days before, and I can only imagine how, if it had gotten so much worse, how I would have, gone on such a big trip and carried my luggage on my back, and, sat on an airplane and like experienced that discomfort, especially while being away from home. That was definitely something that was raising my anxiety of, how is this going to be treatable? And am I going to start to feel better quickly? And again, I had known that shingles is not exactly something that, comes and goes overnight. And so I was really worried about how that was going to impact that. And then additionally, I had a wedding. And so with this, big rash on the back of my back, I was concerned about how I was going to have to change what I was wearing, or if I'd be comfortable enough to wear a dress to go to this function. I also don't want to walk around with this big, visible sores on my back at an event. How is my husband going to sort of put his arms around me and dance at a function like this? Is it going to look strange? Am I going to feel uncomfortable, self-conscious? So there's definitely lots of missed moments that could come around with this. So yes, that definitely resonates with me.
Mm-hmm. Were you able to take your vacation?
Yes, yes, I
Okay.
was. I had the medication. I took the medication with me. And yes, I did.
Okay, so that's good to know. Is you were still
Yes.
able to make it work.
Yes.
So I mean, aside from, you just mentioned two very special events that of course nobody wants to miss out on: weddings, vacations, big plans. But I think there's also something about it affecting your daily routine
100%. Yes.
and work and things like that. And so what was the most challenging part of that in your daily routine and in your regular life?
Yeah, I mean, in my regular life, as you mentioned, I have 4 children, and it just seems that at some point or every point throughout the day when my kids are around, someone is on top of me, leaning on me, arms around me, hugging me. And you don't think about that in your regular life. It's just the normal part of your life. You're happy with everybody, putting their arms around you. That's not a problem. But when you're experiencing such discomfort, in addition to the concern that what you have, you may pass on to someone else, raised my anxiety and was something that I was constantly thinking about all of the time. I would get into bed at night with my partner and, just a regular him rubbing my back or anything along those lines. Like, I had to be very aware to say, no, just don't put your hand on my back. One, it's super uncomfortable and painful, and I'm in a spot that I feel like I'm going to be able to sleep through the night, or at least fall asleep. And 2, it's enough that I have it. I don't want to pass that on to you. And so it was, it was constantly on my mind. I think really until it was visibly gone, not even when I felt better did I feel like, okay, it's okay. I can take a deep breath and relax and let my kids throw their arms on me and, lie in bed at night with my kids when I'm putting them to sleep with a tank top on. I felt like I should always be wearing long sleeves, cover the sores in my torso so that I wasn't exposing them to anything. So in that sense, it was constantly on my mind and affecting my daily life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you're kind of touching on one of my next questions, which was, we talk a lot about the physical pain, the physical discomfort, but it also has a huge impact on your mental health. And you kind of mentioned anxiety and feeling also lingering anxiety. So can you speak a little bit about some of those challenges that came along with it?
Yeah. Part of me thinks, and I don't know if it's sort of medically proven or not, but I think that, in my case, I was under a lot of stress at the time. And I think that potentially that played a role in me developing shingles. And because of that, or because I think that, anytime I feel like my stress levels are increasing, I worry that that's something that is going to happen again. And I worry, since I've had it once, will I have it more times? Will it get worse each time? And because it was initially just felt with, again, no symptoms or visible symptoms, it's when I first got it and didn't know about it, it was one thing. But now knowing what that pain is like, knowing what those symptoms felt like, I feel like I'm very hyper aware anytime there's discomfort on my torso or anywhere else on my body that could potentially turn into that. And so, I'm concerned about my stress levels. I'm concerned about any sort of little feeling that I have that remotely feels like the shingles felt in the first place. It's definitely affected my mental health in that sense, that I'm constantly thinking about it. It's not something that I want to experience again. And so I'm very aware of that.
Yeah, and I'm sure that is an experience that I'm sure a lot of people resonate with. If you just don't want to feel ill, you never want to be sick or feel ill. So kind of anything that might set that off feels very kind of nerve-wracking and anxiety inducing.
Yeah, I think like when you have a cold or a sore throat or something along those lines, there's some things that are easier to push through, and you don't worry so much about passing it on or infecting anybody else in your life, or, you feel uncomfortable and unwell, but you're still able to push through and sort of do everything normally. And it might be a few days and then you'll get back to yourself. Whereas, this was a lot longer, a lot more discomfort and a lot more concern about passing it on.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we're talking about awareness. And as you kind of mentioned earlier, you weren't aware of shingles when you kind of initially started experiencing some of the symptoms. So I want to know, were your friends and family at all aware? Did they kind of understand what you were experiencing in any way? And I want to also kind of add on to it, what ways you found that worked best to support you.
My understanding was that shingles was something that people older than me experienced more commonly than people my age. And so speaking to older members of my family was something that I did and found, that some people had experienced it. I also did learn through conversation after the fact. One of my friends also had shingles in a different position, but we were, I guess, sort of able to commiserate with one another in terms of our experience and what that was like. In terms of support, I think I personally just tried to learn myself a little bit more about it and then educate my immediate family about it so that they understood a little bit more what I was going through and why I didn't want, them to throw their arms around me or hug me from behind or rub my back while I was experiencing it. So I think, a lot of education and conversation, and people definitely understood. I don't think that there was anyone that I had the conversation with. I mean, outside of my young children that I said, oh yeah, I have shingles, that they were like, oh, I've never heard of that before. I mean, everyone's heard of it before. What I actually found was that people were a little frightened by it. Like, oh my God, don't come into the office, or, don't come near us, out of concern, but also out of concern for themselves, I think, and the understanding of how contagious is it? And if you, have it on your hand and you touch your computer, is that going to be passed on to someone else? And so I think that was probably like the most shocking in terms of people's reactions to it. But everybody knew what shingles was enough to know, oh, that's not good.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's interesting that you mentioned that, because I do think that is, people know the word, but maybe they don't really understand all of the symptoms, all of the effects, and also kind of the intricacies of what it is. So do you think that that's true also for just the general public as well, outside of your friends and family and things?
Probably. It's probably less common amongst, certain groups of friends or certain groups of people or age groups, et cetera, that the less people are educated, the less they know. And it's easier to have this big reaction and this big concern about something that they're not fully educated on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to ask also about prevention. And so that we know that vaccination can prevent against shingles and lessen some of the symptoms. But we also know that uptake of shingles vaccination is quite low. So why do you believe this is? And what do you think we can be doing to help increase uptake rates in Canada?
Like my initial thought is education. I think when we can't expect people to take action and get vaccinated for something that they don't believe is a problem for their life, right? And so if it's not something that anyone in your family has experienced or any of your close friends have experienced, and it's not a concern in your daily life, then it's not something that you're going to run and say, give this to me now. I, on the other hand, as soon as I'm eligible, will say exactly that, give it to me now. I don't want to experience this again, but that's because I have experienced it. So for people who haven't experienced it before, I don't think that they understand how bad it could be. I think we need to educate. We need to educate about what it looks like, what it feels like, how to identify it, when, but also this understanding of just because the vaccine is available for people who are older and just because it's more prominent in people who are older does not mean that you cannot get it when you're younger, right? And so starting to educate when you're in your 50s is not necessarily the most helpful, because it's not a proven science that you're not going to experience it beforehand. And so I think education earlier on, education about what the long lasting effects are, what it feels like, how to identify it, what the side effects could be, and so on and so forth, and how the vaccine can stop that from happening when you're eligible and how to get it are all part of getting the message out there.
And do you think that's a pretty common misconception, that this only applies to older people? It doesn't apply to me. I'm young, I'm healthy, whatever, do you think that's?
Yes, yeah, for sure. I think we all think about chickenpox and it's almost the reverse, right? It's almost, when we were kids, we all got chickenpox and it was sort of expected that would be the case. You got chickenpox. It wasn't a great experience, but you got it. You probably got it at the same time as your siblings. You were itchy. It was uncomfortable. Time passed. It went away. And that was the end of it. And then I remember as a kid, when adults got chickenpox, it was much more rare. It was not something that many adults were experiencing. But when they did, it was 1,000 times worse than it was for all the kids who had it at the same time. And so I think it's the same type of thing. You can get it earlier. It's not going to be great. It's more prevalent when you're older, but I think that's what people think. They think young kids get chickenpox or used to, and older adults get shingles. And so we'll each in our own age groups be concerned about those specific diseases. But that's not necessarily accurate.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point to raise, and that also impacts, we talk a lot about healthy aging, and that impacts how you can maintain your health across the life course. So I want to ask, aside from education, which we've talked about, are there any other kind of practical barriers that might prevent people from getting vaccinated that we can maybe start to address?
I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. Is it a vaccine that OHIP covers? Are there financial barriers? I don't know the answers to any of those questions. And so I'm not exactly sure what else there would be.
Yeah. And again, that speaks to the importance of education is right. Having that first step of understanding what are the steps to being vaccinated, so that you can then address, well, I can't get it for this reason, or that reason.
Yeah.
So as we kind of come a little bit to a close, I want to know, what is one thing you would tell people about shingles vaccination, or sorry, just shingles in general, the experience of having shingles? What is one thing that you hope for people to take away from the conversation?
I think that like most things, early intervention is really important. And I would definitely hope that people take away from this conversation that if something doesn't feel right, if you can't wear your own clothes and feel comfortable in them, despite the fact that nothing is visible, to speak up and ask your doctor and not feel ashamed or embarrassed for asking, quote unquote, a silly question. I would encourage people to explain that feeling, I can only imagine that, if you called your doctor and said, I have this burning sensation on my skin, I can't even be in my own clothes, that, a doctor would turn around and say, yeah, that's not right. And that's not normal. And this probably is what it is. And so I would really encourage people to just remove that sort of discomfort of speaking up and speak up, because I think that early intervention, if it's earlier than when you can get the vaccine, is very important. And then I would also, say on the other hand, if you don't have it, consider yourself very lucky and get the vaccine as soon as you're eligible for it, because you'll be happy not to experience it, instead of saying, I wish I got the vaccine after getting it.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a great point to end on. And I think, again, everyone stay tuned to the Shingles Awareness Week. So, I mean, the education that we talked about, the point of the whole week is to raise education. And so I hope that people will also, pay close attention to this conversation, but also to the many other efforts that are going on during the week. So thank you so much for joining our discussion about shingles and for providing a patient perspective on shingles. And I also thank all of the listeners for tuning into this podcast. So that is all from us for now, but we'll be back soon with more materials and more educational information. So thank you so much.
Thanks.